Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now pleased to introduce our next panel, Extremes of Violence, Understanding Far Left and Far Right Terrorism, which will be moderated by Ms. Hannah Alam, a reporter with ProPublica. She'll be joined by Mr. Seamus Hughes, Senior Research Faculty at the University of Nebraska, Omaha's National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or NCITE. Dr. Michael Kenney, Wesley W. Posvar Chair in International Security Studies, Director of the Matthew B. Ridgway Center, and Professor of International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Mr. Peter Smith, Researcher and Journalist, Militant Wire, and Ms. Elizabeth Newman, former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention, Department of Homeland Security, and Chief Strategy Officer, Moonshot.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope your conference has been going great. If you, just like we did, just received alerts on your phone about a shooting involving Charlie Kirk, you will know how important this panel and this discussion is today about the picture on the domestic front. I thought we'd first just jump right in and talk a little bit about language, because this panel is called The Extremes at the Far Left and the Far Right, but as we've seen so many times, a lot of these attacks don't have one single clear motivation anymore. We've heard this called salad bar extremism or mixed motive extremism over the years. They're just not neatly categorized. How do you account for those when you're deciding where does this belong? I thought, Seamus, maybe you could talk about that. How do you all handle that at NCITE?
First of all, thank you, the Soufan group, for having me. I thought I was going to get an easy question, and so this isn't fair, but let me dive into it a little bit. So let's use an academic term, right? The threat landscape is basically a mess, right? You've got a kind of burgeoning and rising far-right extremism, a emboldened far-left extremism, a single issue, whether it be pro-choice, pro-life, all of those dynamics playing into effect, and we can rack and stack them. That all makes sense. This guy goes in this category, this guy's going in that category, and then the politicians debate whether this or a threat's bigger here and there, and the Twitter debates happen nonetheless. But there's an interesting dynamic here, which is kind of this idea of mixed ideologies or salad bars or things like that. Humans, by their very nature, are complex, right? And so we may not come through these things on one ideology or one issue, and they don't fit neatly in a box. My colleague Brian Jenkins was fond of saying that terrorism does not attract the well-adjusted. And so sometimes it's hard to fit these guys in here. What I find the most interesting dynamic, and I think an area we need to have a debate on in the analytical field, is this idea of nihilistic violent extremism. I actually quite like the term. I think it's a good catch-all for these type of things. The more direct one is, shit posters, right? But this is a different dynamic here, right? These are individuals who want to rack up the score. If you look at the shooter in Minneapolis, you look at their manifesto, and it is, I hate Jews, I hate guns, I hate Israel, I hate Donald Trump, right? The point is to get and press the buttons of everyone online in different categories so that you're talking about that manifesto. And that's really what they're going to have to deal with, is the FBI and law enforcement, is these guys are terminally online in a way that is not going to fit neatly in the boxes. And the more concerning issue is, for the last 20 years, we've been used to silos, right? You've got your ITOS team or your International Terrorism Squad, you got your Domestic Terrorism Squad, and so the ITOS guys know to look at Anwar al-Awlaki, and the DT guys know to look for 1488, right? But now if you get these guys that float back and forth, it requires a level of understanding of all forms of extremism and ideology that you didn't have to have, say, even 5 years ago. And that becomes difficult because our systems of government are not set up to account for that.
Well, and one of those hard to characterize movements, as you just mentioned, NVE, nihilistic violent extremism. The Trump administration has made this a priority. Peter, you've written quite a bit about that. What should we know about where that fits into the domestic threat picture right now?
Also, thank you for having me, Mr. Soufan and Dr. Clark. But yeah, NVE is an evolving framework, but one that I think that works well. Often we can distinguish it from other types of far-right extremism based on whether violence is the purpose as opposed to a means to an end. There's usually not a clear goal. In the instance of the Christchurch shooter, Brenton Tarrant desired to, one, join a pantheon of other shooters and killers, but also was incredibly concerned about what he believed was the replacement of the white race in European countries and European colonized countries. That doesn't exist in NVE. These individuals are looking still to add themselves to this kind of rogues gallery of previous killers, of previous shooters, but they're not trying to build an ethno-state. There's no political goal other than the deaths themselves in the case of attack. And in other senses, it is attention and clout, as one researcher calls it, inside of their community. There's also typically this emphasis on aesthetics over ideology. The Annunciation school church shooting is a good example of that. There were callbacks to numerous other shooters, including Tarrant, the writing of names and symbols all over the gun was a direct reference to him. -51 refers to the amount of people that died at the two Christchurch mosques. And so, yeah, it is, I think that there is an issue with over-attribution. Nihilism is a term that invokes a lot of feelings in people. But ultimately, I think it is a framework that will work well to describe these terminally online, very radical, and oftentimes obsessed with notoriety and, like in the church shooting, infamy.
More on the sort of what we traditionally think of as the far right. You know, at the beginning of this administration, there was a lot of fear that the pardons, over the January 6 pardons, the relaxing of content moderation, that this would all fuel a remobilization or some sort of violent reaction or operating space, for the far right. Has that come to pass? What I don't know who would like to take that. Maybe Elizabeth.
Well, I'll take it on in the sense that I think what we can see in the online environment, the nature of the conversations that are happening are significantly higher in volume this year than last year, which is remarkable because usually in election years you see higher volumes of threats and harassment and saber rattling, if you will, primarily from the right, but also occasionally from the left. What we're seeing now at Moonshot, we have documented an 18% increase in the yearly average compared to the previous year. So it tells me that we're still kind of amped up, if you will. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see offline violence, but quite frequently what we see is that there is a tie. When you do see increases in conversations online recommending or suggesting or encouraging violence, it's not often the poster that actually goes and commits the act of violence, but quite often the person committing the act of violence is participating in those toxic environments. And so there is this relationship between online conversation and offline violence. And for June, for example, we saw a 63% increase in anti-Semitic hate. We saw the highest levels of hate towards Muslims, immigrants, threats against women in June and July. And while you can point to a couple of different incidents, and I think the anti-immigrant hate clearly is tied to a lot of the immigrant actions that the administration is taking that's in the national conversation and people are reacting to it online. But the threats against elected officials are also sky high, and then we had the assassination attempts in June. So there is an element to the conversations that happen online don't stay online. It does inspire people to violence, and if you're just looking at the volume of conversation, it is much higher than it used to be. You really can go back the last 2 years and we would be telling you it's higher than it used to be, it's higher than it used to be. It's not going back down, and that is very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, in reporting on these issues over the past year or so, sometimes I would hear analysts say, oh, we're in a lull on the attack front. And others would say, yeah, but the threats, they're able to keep that, that active threat right at a level that just before it tips into, maybe criminal activity. But now it seems like we're also seeing attacks rising this year. I saw Michael Jensen, I think, from START put out some numbers. Seamus, have you seen anything on that? Or Peter, excuse me, on, it is actually spilling into the street now.
You or me?
I certainly don't have any numbers to back it up, but I think that it's an incredibly active space on the far right. In some senses, you have the idea, the groups, when you're in the kind of the radical right space that support the current administration, you're not seeing the Proud Boys on the streets very much right now because they're very happy with the direction that the immigration debate's moving in and have kind of taken a step back to some degree. On the extreme right, the kind of illiberal, explicitly illiberal right, I think that there's been a real ratcheting up, that they feel more marginalized than ever, and that there is kind of a coming day that they're preparing for and moving towards.
I looked at Jensen's numbers too, actually in preparation for this event. So she's referring to the T2V data set maintained by Michael Jensen and his colleagues at START at the University of Maryland.
That's right.
They just released their numbers. And so I was looking at it from there was clearly an uptick there. It's on the rise. June 25 looked pretty sharp rise there.
And we're talking about attacks across the board.
Yeah, across the board. So I wanted to see, well, how much of this is anti-fascist, how much is anarchist. So I, added some terms to filter out the rest. And yeah, there were a number of incidents, but when I looked into each one, for me, they didn't meet terrorism, but to Seamus's point, definitely violent extremism. I think Seamus makes an important point. Like a lot of what we're seeing, it may be closer to violent extremism than what we traditionally think of as terrorism.
There's some constants here, right? The constants being anti-Semitism is the connective glue that brings together all forms of ideologies. The constant is that we have seen a steady rise of threats against public officials, be they a local DA to a U.S. attorney to the President of the United States, the former President of the United States. And that runs a spectrum of whether it's left-wing extremism or right-wing extremism. And that is a kind of ever-present thing. Because it's late in the afternoon, let's try to be contrarian a little bit and start a conversation. What I find interesting and what's kind of different dynamic is what Peter said is you don't see the Proud Boys on the streets anymore, right? And the different dynamic now is you may see the far left in the streets now and the far right as a reciprocal radicalization, meaning trying to push back on that. So the roles have reversed than they were 5 years ago, right? The galvanizing moment being kind of the enforcement actions by the Trump administration. If you see troops roll into Chicago, or if you see the attack that happened in Texas in July 4th of 11 individuals, including one that shot 30 rounds into an ICE car and injured a ICE detention officer, there might be a moment where we get back into that ebb and flow, right? Where we had the 70s of far left extremism, the 80s and 90s of far right, 2000s being jihadism. We're right now in this weird mix that everyone's angry, right? But at some point, someone's going to pull ahead in the pack. And I would posit that we're probably in an area where we get back to where we were in the 70s.
Great. Michael, this
Yeah,
sounds
I
like
do
he's...
I think that's a great comment. The only thing I would add to that is where we go from here depends in part on the dynamics between state and non-state actors. We've been talking about state and non-state actors a lot the last couple of days. And this is a great example of it's going to depend on how the Trump administration, what they do. This is not, the far left extremism does not unfold in a political vacuum.
What are the main grievances right now?
Well, right now they have two big grievances, Gaza and the United States.
In terms of the immigration crackdown?
Immigration, DC, LA, now Chicago, Portland. Portland, wow, that really struck me because Portland has always been an epicenter of anarchist activism. It's a hot spot, if you will, and has been for years and years. I mean, the oldest formal anti-fascist group, continuing anti-fascist group, is Rose City Antifa, right? Very active scene there. So now we're going to send the National Guard into Portland? Really? Okay. Well, if we do that, yeah, I would expect to see an increase in not just activism and protesting. I would expect to see an increase in violence because there's always going to be a Michael Reinell out there. There's always going to be a Willem von Spronsen out there at the extreme, at the margins, but who are willing to take it a step further.
And are you already hearing or seeing that kind of discourse online, or, all right.
Well, yeah, look, there's always the online stuff, but for me personally, like the sort of work I do, I want to talk to people.
Right.
Right?
Or whether it's online or in person, I mean, are you hearing them actually say, it's time to mobilize and maybe take this further?
Yeah. I mean, we're past that point.
Yeah.
They are mobilizing, but when I say mobilizing, I don't mean they're mobilizing to terrorism.
Right.
They're not. I mean, I was struck by Chris Raia's point earlier today. I thought it was a fascinating presentation. We have the deputy director of the FBI of New York City talking about these different threats. If I was Chris Raia, yeah, there is an anarchist scene in New York City. And by the way, he didn't mention this.
Okay.
Because he has other threats to worry about, and I agree with that. There is an anarchist scene in New York City. There are black blockers in New York City, but that doesn't mean they're mobilizing to terrorism. That's just not how these guys work.
Let's go back to tactics in just a second. I wanted to go back to the far right for a second. And, one thing I've noticed in the discourse on the far right more recently is this real infusion of Christian nationalist rhetoric. Elizabeth, you've written a whole book about this. What are you seeing? What are your fears there? What kind of mobilization are we seeing around that sort of ideology?
Yeah, it actually picks up on the theme that we were just kind of discussing. When I wrote that book, the concern was with a very small segment of Christian nationalism that I would put close to the definition, if not in the definition of extremism. Most Christian nationalism, to be clear, does not advocate for violence. It is what I would consider as a Christian a big concern for the church, because it, in my belief, is idolatrous in the way that it positions itself. And it's a big public policy issue. It's an issue that perhaps the courts need to help address if we do start to see policies get implemented that are preferring one religion over another. So I'm not suggesting it's not an issue for public policy, but for purposes of this forum, the place where I start to get nervous is where you do start to see certain voices implementing both through the state as well as through the church a view that is contradictory to many of the values that we hold dear, such as equality. And there are individuals who hold power now in the government who are attending a church of a pretty well-renowned Christian nationalist who has advocated for women to not have the vote, who has advocated for ethnic, I don't want to say purity as much as separatism, and it basically is racist.
Talking about the Idaho.
Yes, Doug Wilson, and there are others who are in the administration that adhere to these views. Now, I mean, I have to re-emphasize very, very, very small segment, not only of Christianity, but like within the Christian nationalism spectrum itself, believe these things. Most people, when they talk about Christian nationalism, they just want it to go back to what they thought it felt like back in the 1980s or the 1950s when we were a majority Christian country, and they don't want to be made to feel bad for their faith, right? Like that's, if you dig deep, that's really what's at the sentiment of a lot of Christians who adhere to that label. I get really concerned when you have guys that have gone through seminary and have written theological treatises on why violence is justified now. And that there are a few that have written this. And there are some that are now in government who have state power to be able to effectuate some of these changes. Is that what we're seeing at the Department of Defense? When so many military officers that are women are losing their jobs? I mean, are we actually seeing the implementation of basically a harassment level of extremism by removing women or people of color from positions because of Christian nationalist belief? I don't know. I mean, they're using plausible deniability in how they're going about it. But it does leave one wondering if you're not committed to those American values of all of us are created in the image of God and have that human dignity that we laid out in the Declaration of Independence and are instead implementing a very, very narrow view of what Christianity actually doesn't say. Yeah, we might be on the precipice of a state form of extremism there.
Peter, you've also studied these movements closely, followed these movements closely. Are there any other sort of organizing trends or ideologies that you're seeing on the far right now?
Yeah, again, certainly to focus on the extreme right, I think that there is a heavy emphasis on the systematization of of violence. There's a large amount of manuals that are produced that not only instruct people and try to inspire them to carry out terrorist attacks, but also how to do that, where to strike at a power substation. There was recently an individual, Brandon Russell, who was convicted for him and his girlfriend's plan to attack a power substation, with the idea that when the power goes out, everyone will immediately turn on one another, and that will kind of helter-skelter kick off the race war.
And he was able to plot that because he was released.
Yes.
After only 3 years, I think.
3 years for bomb-making materials that were discovered after one of his roommates murdered two of his other roommates. And Russell founded the Atomwaffen division. Yeah, there's a disturbing trend in that way. Also, I think in the more radical sphere, you hear a lot about remigration, this idea that not only will illegal immigrants be forced to leave, but everybody who is not of European descent would be forced by some type of legal means to exit the country. We see this heavily in Canada. I believe it originated in Europe, the term, where it's found a lot of cachet, and then you hear it quite often here as well. So there is this kind of cross-pollination of ideas.
During the first Trump administration, I remember there were a lot of public statements trying to make this equivalence between the far left and the far right, when in fact there were very steep differences in lethality, numbers, weapons, and other factors. What does that gap look like now? Has that changed in the past 5 years? What are we seeing now? I remember writing about Vance Bronson, and I think I was writing about him because he was the only Antifa fatality. What does that look like now?
I think that there is still a gap between far-right terrorism and far-left terrorism. I think that gap still exists. That's why I was making some of the points I made earlier. I think the puzzle with the far left folks is, why aren't we seeing more far left terrorism? In fact, that was a topic for the Mount Rushmore panel earlier, and I thought we heard some good things on that. The only thing I would add was, again, with respect to the anarchists and the anti-fascists, is one reason why we haven't seen more far left terrorism is because a lot of them just don't believe in it, right? So what do I mean? They believe in direct action, right? They believe in activism, they believe in property damage.
And in anti-fascist circles, what is a direct action?
Like a riot is a direct action. Like they love to riot, right? So a direct action is a form, it's part of their repertoire of contention if you like to study social movements, and because that's what this is. Ultimately, these are social movements that we're talking about at the macro level, and now we're talking about groups and individuals that represent the marginalized of those social movements, whether they're on the right side of the ideological spectrum or the left. So direct action is a form of political protest, essentially. It could include riots. It could include even protesting, right? Typically, like general strikes.
Okay.
Not just your garden variety protests. Like they actually kind of scoff at things like no kings, right? Because
That's not sufficiently
it's not enough.
militant. Yeah.
It's not enough. It's like protesting the way the state would have you protest, which they don't want. They want to go a step further. So don't do a no kings protest, do a general strike.
Right.
Like shut things down, right? That's how
But
you
what they're not doing, and it sounds like, or at least in recent history, I mean, I would always hear analysts say they're more associated with melee violence. Like it would be, throwing a Molotov cocktail or something at a riot or something like that,
Yeah,
rather
melees.
than sort of strategically planning an operation. Has that changed, or are there examples where we are seeing on the far left actual sort of plots?
Well, Malays, like, this is what they love to do, especially in Europe, riots, right? And it's a little misleading to say these riots are completely spontaneous, as if there's no organization. Yeah, there's organization behind. Now, sometimes it could be genuinely spontaneous, but in terms of the far left anarchists, especially in Europe, if we want to broaden it out there, yeah, there's a very robust tradition of riots. West Germany, Greece, UK, elsewhere. And we see, a little bit of that here. Like that's what the black blockers were trying to do, right?
Recreate some of that
Yeah,
European
get
style
that
anti-fascism.
riot action. For them, that's a direct action. But it's not terrorism.
Okay, and you haven't seen that changing or anything recently?
No,
Not-
no,
Anyone
I
else?
do want to ask, though, for everybody's opinion, though, we've seen more assassination attempts and assassinations, and that's different. We weren't talking about that 3 years ago, and so I do wonder if
And you're not
that's-
talking specifically far left, or are you?
just across the spectrum. I mean, the first Trump assassination attempt, probably that individual falls more in the nihilistic violent extremism category than far left, far right. And the second attempt maybe was more solidly politically motivated. Luigi Mangione is an assassination, not on the spectrum, but still like anti-system, right? Like there's something that's shifted in the way that when I listen to scholars that study 1960s, 1970s, it feels more like that than the spectrum that we're used to assessing things over the last 30 years.
Well, what does that mean for? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for 2 decades. I generally get exhausted by the question of rack and stack the threats, right? I mean, there's moments when you rack and stack, right? When the ISIS has a caliphate the size of the UK and they're taking 100,000 people in as foreign fighters. Okay, you rack and stack your resources to address that, right? Immediately following the Oklahoma City bombing, you rack and stack your resources towards the far right. Right now, I don't think it's an either-or proposition, right? It is generally not a good thing for people to be okay with throwing Molotov cocktails at federal courthouses. Generally, as a society, we should probably be against that. It's generally not a good thing to dox the families of law enforcement, right? It's generally not a good thing to threaten both the president and the former president. We're getting to that, right? It is generally, we're at a point right now where I don't necessarily think a rack and stack is where we should be, right? Unfortunately, we're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same exact time. Now, that makes law enforcement's job a little bit harder in terms of where you put your resources on things, but I'm not necessarily sure we need to be 90% somewhere and 10% there.
Well, that was going to be
I suggest as we get to more mixed ideologies too, it becomes less and less important in those
Yeah.
dynamics.
Well, that's what I was going to ask is like, is this framework even useful anymore? Are you thinking about whole new ways to categorize and study these issues?
Listen, you should still categorize as best you can. I mean, I think there's a useful endeavor for that, if only to see trend lines, right? You can say, okay, listen, far-right extremists tend to be interested in using this type of technique and tactics, and far-left extremists tend to be interested in property damage and other things, and this is that. That's a useful endeavor on this, but I think we have to be okay with the unknown at some point, and we are getting to the unknown.
And what does that mean for, like, the Minneapolis attack, the attacker you mentioned earlier? the
I
suspect?
mean, this is picking up on Seamus's point. His manifesto was just a performance of a variety of ideologies that at the core of it is you had a really troubled young man who indications are there were plenty of people that saw that he was troubled and he needed help. And the system that failed was not that we didn't see the ideology. The system that failed is that there was no way to refer that person to a place where he could get help before he escalated to violence. And so rather than focusing, I like Seamus said, there is a tool and a need for understanding the threat, but we have over-indexed on ideology study and not on what John Horgan just talked to us about, the psychology behind why people mobilized violence. And once you understand those behavioral indicators, how you can detect them and set up systems at a state level to be able to off-ramp that individual well before they are on that pathway to violence. And that's what's missing here, is not an understanding of these ideologies that are going to morph at the speed of the internet. Like tomorrow's ideology, I mean, 764 comm network, that we weren't talking about that 2 years ago. 2 years from now, it'll be something completely different. They will just keep morphing. It's not that. It's the underlying unmet needs that are in, now at this point, a large part of our population that we have got to address both through secondary intervention, meaning disrupting somebody that's already radicalized or mobilizing to violence, as well as the primary piece here. Like, we have to grapple with, we're not okay as a society. When you have this level of violence, something is broken. We've got to address those upstream effects.
So that brings me to a question about, what the government is doing, to understand the psychology of it and to come up with threat assessment plans. That requires research and prevention programs, all of which have been cut very, very deeply across the board by this administration. We're also seeing a reorientation, it seems, of some of the enforcement side around the deportation immigration mission. So what do you make of this? I mean, well, you used to lead the CP3, whatever, TVTP. I know it's undergone several makeovers. And now it's sort of a shell of its former self.
It's hard to watch. In 2017, 2018, when we were seeing the rise of far-right violence, and then also we're starting to have these conversations of, this ideology is really loosely held. It feels like they're just committing acts of violence for violence sake, and maybe we need to be looking at this differently. And Rand did a big study for us and kind of came out on the other side going, no, we need to be investing in violence prevention. There were a lot of fits and starts over the 10 years prior to that. We learned from them some efforts that didn't work and didn't need to be retried. But the main takeaways was you can do violence prevention. It should not be law enforcement led. It should not be led out of DC. It needs to be state or regionally based in a urban area. And it needs to be multidisciplinary, and you need to have referral systems other than law enforcement systems. And I know I'm saying that to a law enforcement audience, but the reality is part of the reason that bystanders don't report is because they don't trust law enforcement. And so you need alternatives that will work with law enforcement that have already been trained to know when they do have a duty to warn, when they do need to report, but that there needs to be a stronger system in place so that we can both refer and treat individuals well before they start mobilizing to violence. I don't know. Like, all of the money got pulled. It was a very small amount of money to begin with. We, compared to our colleagues overseas, are woefully under investing in violence prevention, and any little bit that we were investing, it just got pulled. So I think it's up to the states now, and the state budgets are obviously under a crunch, so I don't have a ton of hope there. But maybe money starts to flow after the attacks. And so I think that might be where we are, is trying to hold on to the research and the knowledge that we have. And then at some point, maybe the politicians will catch up and realize, for a little bit of investment in violence prevention, we can save a whole lot of lives and a lot of money that gets spent in the investigations and then the cleanup after attacks.
Even the Michael Jensen statistics we were citing before, that gives us any kind of picture of what it looks like, that's, as I understand, government funded, right?
Yep.
Did either, I think
Yeah,
Seamus,
just
you
I
wanna-
would quickly add, just the only silver lining to having a heightened threat environment is at some point you can't rush your way out of this problem, right? It's the reason why at the height of ISIS, EDNY set up a disengagement program for a couple of the ISIS cases, because they didn't have enough agents to work those cases all the way to the end to prosecution, right? And it didn't make sense to veer off a 16-year-old and read his diary for 2 years. We're probably going to get to that point when it comes to this. It'll just take a level of threat where you have to say, listen, I've got 250 active investigations for 764. It's now 1,000. I don't have enough manpower to work this. And so we're going to have to get that adjustment. It's a learning curve when you get a new administration. They'll probably get to that hope. I'm hopeful they will be. Could be my naivete, but I am an Irishman Catholic, and so I generally think the good of people, even though I disagree with them.
Did you have one thing to add?
Yeah, just again on the Annunciation shooter, having read their manifesto several times, up until a few weeks before the attack, they were constantly talking about how they might stop themselves, how they wish somebody would stop them. Like, this was interspliced with their, very overt desire to cause incredible harm, specifically to children. But it starts, I believe, in May and goes up into a couple of days before the attack happened. And from the start, there are clear moments where they mention leakages, where they spilled a little bit too much to somebody. Individuals, teachers, caregivers, they require some training. And some of these programs that have been cut have included training that has not abstractly saved lives, but there are literal examples of how that training has allowed individuals to react in hostage situations. There's one instance I'm thinking of where I believe it was a rabbi and a few people were taken hostage, and he credits the training with allowing him to distract the attacker by strategically throwing a chair and funneling everybody else out.
We just have a couple minutes left, but I kind of know what we're going to face when we get out of here. We're going to, all go and check up on the Charlie Kirk incident, and even without looking, you can kind of know these things have a pattern, right? An incident like this happens, and then it seems like forces on the left and on the right immediately get busy looking for clues and signs, and was it my team or their team, and really trying to sort of politicize it often before we know a single thing about what actually happened or have seen any kind of manifesto or anything like that. I mean, is it possible to even study these issues now and to give a clear and accurate picture to the public when the backdrop is this really freighted political moment? How does that affect your work?
Yes, it's still possible to study these issues, but we have to recognize that in the immediate aftermath of an attack or an incident, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. So we should always be, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here, but be quite skeptical of the early reports behind any incident. The other thing that I think about when I think about this latest news goes back to Elizabeth's point about assassinations. I think that's an important point. I do think we're seeing an uptick in that type of political violence, which can be terrorism, but isn't necessarily so. But to go back to your question, Hannah, yeah, we've been in the terrorism studies community, people like John Horgan and Brian Jenkins and Martha Crenshaw and Colin Clark and many others have been doing this for a long time. And one thing they know is that you have to be very careful in the immediate aftermath of an attack because there's just so much, misinformation out there. You let it settle, take the time, draw back, look historically. I love looking historically. I think in order to understand what's going on with the far left today, you have to understand the Weather Underground and that whole scene 50 years ago.
Because we only have just a minute left, I want to see if anyone else has how do politics complicate what you're trying to research and to study? I already hear of people, changing the title of their paper, their research grant to make sure it doesn't lean too heavily this way or that, in hopes of getting funded. What are are there other ways that it's interfering?
I mean, listen, I'm at NCITE, which we're aggressively apolitical. And as a nature, I'm generally aggressively apolitical too. I don't think my wife even knows who I voted for. Because I purposely do that, right? Which is you call a spade, and then you hope for the best, and you don't go terminally online or take the easy bait that you would immediately when an attack happens or things like that. I think it's incumbent on all of us to just avoid as best we can trying to be aggressively political in nature. And I'll give you an example. There was a lot of questions in the height of ISIS of the issue of a travel ban, right? And there's two ways to approach that from a data perspective.
We have 30 seconds.
I disagree with the travel ban, you shouldn't do it, right? And the president's wrong. The other way to look at it is, of the 215 people who have been arrested for ISIS-related activities, the vast majority are US citizens and legal permanent residents, and as such, if you're looking for a policy recommendation, a travel ban is not the way to go. You said the same exact thing, you just haven't pissed off half the audience, right? And so it's a matter of framing the way you do your research.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you.